Welcome back. The final session this afternoon is going to focus on both cybersecurity as well as data science and data analytics. And Olivia introduced our speakers, so I think the best thing to do is turn to our first session. I don't know who's leading off. Is it you, Tim? Or
Oh, it's Allison.
Allison, okay. Welcome, Allison.
Hi. Is this picking it up?
Put it closer to you.
Closer?
Stand up.
Okay. I'm Allie Atami. I'm a partner at the Groom Law Group in the Fiduciary Responsibility Group. So with my co-presenters, Tim and Ben, we'll be discussing cybersecurity as it relates to retirement plans. Cybersecurity with respect to retirement plans is really becoming quite a hot topic. And as more and more data is both produced and utilized in retirement plans, it becomes much more important to protect that data. As a lawyer, I like to talk about allocating responsibility, and that's really the key issue in terms of data protection from the point of view of a plan sponsor. They want to know who's responsible for protecting this data that's being used and created. Right now, there's not a particularly clear roadmap for who is responsible and how they're responsible and how to discuss that. And that's where Tim and Ben come in. They are going to discuss the potential proposed solution for how those discussions can occur. As you all know, retirement plans are subject to ERISA in the U.S., and ERISA does not, unfortunately, have a very comprehensive section that discusses plan data. With health plans, obviously there's HIPAA that goes into the protection of health information. There's no corresponding retirement section. Plan sponsors especially are very concerned about the liability for data breaches. And so they would like to have discussions with their service providers, such as record keepers, about the cybersecurity processes that are in place in order to create sort of a trail of a prudent process that has been undertaken in order to establish that the plan sponsor is not liable for any breaches. And so they need to be able to have a conversation. And Tim and his group have really created the manner of having that conversation. So do you want to discuss that?
Sure. Thanks, Allie. So by way of a little background, so I'm Tim Rouse. I'm the executive director for the Spark Institute, and we're an industry association that represents the record-keeping industry. So all of the major record keepers, the Fidelity's, Vanguards, T. Rowe's, Bank of America's, whoever, who are out there record-keeping plans today are member firms. And my member firms came to me actually 2 years ago now. And Allie laid the groundwork for what was driving the interest on the part of the plan sponsors with regard to cybersecurity. My members came to me and said, we're seeing this proliferation of questions around cybersecurity. But not only are we seeing a proliferation of questions, we're also seeing that the information that they're asking for is of such a is very intimate and stuff that we will not provide to our clients. So Paulo earlier at lunch talked about the trust and knowledge, and we had this dilemma where we had the need to transfer some knowledge to our clients in order to gain their trust, but the knowledge that we needed to give to them needs to be by necessity private and confidential. So if we were out, if plan sponsors were out in an RFP process or clients were asking for this information, if you're giving that out to everybody and you're giving that out to even prospects, eventually that information is going to get out onto the internet and out into the world, and then the bad guys will have access or at least a roadmap into your systems. So that created this dilemma that we needed to solve. And so what we did was we decided that what we wanted to do was to create this data security oversight board. And we immediately recognized, in order for this to be successful, it needed to be not just the record keepers, not just the record keepers coming in and checking a box or coming up with some sort of self-certification, that it needed to have the plan sponsors represented, and typically represented by their consultants. And that's where Ben comes into the picture. And an interesting story was the very first meeting that we had of this group. You had the record keepers on one side, and you had Ben and the other consulting firms on the other side of the table. And the record keeper said, "Hey, we'll just go down the list and we'll just check off boxes, and then we'll just certify and everything will be okay." And Ben said, "Okay, well, if that's what you're going to do, then I'll put on the rubber glove and I'll come and visit you." And after that, it really kind of worked together nicely. I mean, we recognized what each party had their role in being on this board. And this board has been really tremendous in terms of it's very collegial. They immediately recognized this board was made up of chief information security officers, chief risk officers from all my major firms. And they immediately recognized that a breach of any one of them is a reputational damage to all. So it was very collegial in the sense that they want to share information amongst one another. In fact, just last week we created with FSISAC, we announced the creation of a brand new Retirement and Industry Council that will allow my member firms to share information around cybersecurity in a confidential way so that they're not necessarily out there advertising to the world that they have had a breach, but that others may learn from what's happening so that they can see bad IP addresses, they can see different scams that are happening, and it's not attributable back to any one firm. And so we're kicking that off in June. But I'll now turn it over to Ben to kind of give the perspective of the plan consultants and how it actually works.
Sure. So thank you, Tim, and thank you, Allison. A couple quick points about, I think, what the key challenges are that we're trying to deal with here. There are, first of all, pre-existing measures that exist for record keepers, big financial services institutions, a host of different types of industries. Healthcare industry has one approach, the banking sector has another approach, the credit card industry has an approach, the record keeping industry has a myriad of approaches for threat sharing. And so what we already know is the case is that people are doing a very, very good job of making these big institutions effectively Fort Knox for a lot of their data because it's so essential that they're able to protect themselves. At the same time, they've all figured out how to do that on their own. And also because they represent trillions of dollars of assets, they are frequently attacked. And by frequently, I mean multiple times per minute in some respects. Other times, very, very intricate attacks over a long period of time trying to crack through to get to the big target. So what the Data Security Oversight Board was dealing with was this kind of destructive cycle. And I think this exists in a lot of industries, and it kind of goes like this. You find out that your service provider of some kind had some form of breach. You ask them, have you had a breach? And they say, well, it depends on what you mean by breach. Or they say no. Sometimes they're obligated to say no because breach is defined in different states and municipalities by law, and other times it's defined by their insurance policies. And generally speaking, if you can get out of it, or you don't want to violate the terms of those laws, or you don't want to trigger your insurance, you really would rather not provide that information. Moreover, it's a thread that you start to pull. You find out that there is this cyber risk or maybe some potential risk, and you want to find out more about what's happening with your money and your participant information. Sometimes you're compelled to, by law, by policy, something else like that. And then you ask a series of questions to determine whether or not your information and your money is safe. And what you find out is that people are able to give you some information, but not every institution is very expert in asking these questions. When we first started the board, one of the big providers in the space said, we'll give you a list of our commonly asked cyber questions. The list is 1,300 questions long. They have 23 pages of compulsory contract information that large clients have required them to incorporate in every contract about cyber. So this is not a well-organized space for providing a response. It's very ad hoc. So also is insurance. And so what we ultimately did is we said, well, we have to find some way of standardizing this due diligence process that doesn't lead to the destructive cycle where you say, was there a breach? They say no. You find out there was a breach. You can confirm that they didn't tell you what you consider to be the truth. And then the rubber glove comes on that Tim alluded to, right, where you send the 1,300 questions and you send a barrage because you feel exposed. So what we came up with was a series of 16 basic common auditable standards. working with member firms from the ICPA, the CISOs of approximately 30 organizations, I think, on the board, and the other membership of Spark, and a host of consultants. And these were to form common standards across the different so-called CSFs. And in cyber, that's Cybersecurity Framework. That's the general architecture of how you go about organizing your defenses. Now, that allows commonality across a series of international and national standards that are being employed across a range of governments and other entities. So that way we can say, here is the same thing we're testing, not is it the ISO standard, or is it the NIST standard, or is it what your corporation says is a hybrid of the two. It's what's common across them all and most materially important. And then also, there's a couple of options for providing third-party attestation via ASCPA firms and other expert entities to provide a lower cost than a so-called SOC 2 audit to say, yes, we are meeting these core minimum standards and establishing some consensus around what that is. And part of the rationale for the composition of the board being a mixture of consultants and advocates for plans, and thankfully we have a couple of states that are self-administered, and so a couple of states are also participants in the board for their pension systems, since they're kept in-house. And all of those entities came together and said, what doesn't just serve record keeping or consulting or clients, but what works for everybody. And so the next generation of that will be the threat sharing to see where the weaknesses are, and then being able to share them not just amongst record keepers, as Tim said, there's the RAC now at FSISAC, but also looking at whether or not government entities might have their own threat sharing community, what that form that would look like, and similarly whether or not the client side should have some form of threat sharing community. Because as we know, in this space, the threat evolves every few months and pivots quickly to the new weak spot. So a long-lasting regulation or a way we've done things for a long time doesn't really suffice to mitigate the threat. And so going forward, we're trying to have greater awareness of and popularization of this approach so that there can be low-cost, common terms due diligence that will both reduce the cost of providing the due diligence, instill trust, and at the same time prevent due diligence that is destructive of the very security processes that are put in place to protect the industry. Because if you keep having to have distrust lead to disclosures of your protections, you're basically having people distrust you and you're giving the combination to your lock all the time into the public domain. And we're seeking to interdict that cycle. So, Tim, any further comment on that? That's kind of where I was going to wrap up on this for the time being, in terms of process, or maybe the AUP process a little bit, give a sense of that.
So and Ben alluded to that, we've worked with, and now we're instituting this, and we're getting the word out to plan sponsors, to other associations, and there's been a huge uptake in this, which we're really excited about. In fact, a number of our members came back and said, we'd love to be able to utilize these same standards in other areas of our firm other than just retirement, because it really is one of the member firms, when we got together in a room and discussed, and we were working with one of the major auditing firms, said, well, we're spending 30,000 hours a year just answering questions. And I kind of looked around and said, that's got to be crazy. And every single one of my members shook their head and said, well, yeah, we're doing the same thing for these 1,300 questions. So the beauty of this now is that there's an audit that's done based on the 16 standards. That audit is then distributed to the consultant community or to the plan sponsor. It doesn't stop the questions, but what it does is it greatly reduces them. So now the consulting industry has an easy means of which to compare apples to apples when they're looking at firm to firm to firm when they're evaluating. And they'll come up with their own scores based on their own methodology for evaluating that, but it starts to give us a common framework to speak from.
Yep, and I'll just give you an anecdote as to how pressing this is on this side of the thing, and I'll wrap up, and before Doug cuts us off, is I went to a board meeting some time back, and it was me and 6 representatives of state pension systems. And just because it was a closed door and we were all talking amongst ourselves, there was a discussion of, oh, I was hacked in this fashion. Were you hacked in that fashion? No, but I was hacked in this fashion. 100% of them had recently lost capital due to hacks. And every client I've visited since I've taken on this responsibility with whom I've discussed this has had capital losses at some level, either with their record keeper, service providers, data breaches themselves. And even just by accident, I'm serving in my capacity. I've been emailed at some point the detailed Social Security information of over 100,000 people by accident. So don't think that this is a well-secured space, but we're all working on it. But there is very much a pressing need. And so this is some of the first steps at moving in that direction. So Doug, you can cut me off now.
All right, thank you, panel on data security. Now we're